John or my father. So these are the very opening lines of the book. When I was very young, I knew things about my father that had no plot, no narrator, no audience. I don't remember being told these things. They were just there, like unwelcome relatives, installed for the long haul, sponging off my parents, and preventing our family from living completely in the present. They existed with a level of substantiality equal to that of my ancestresses, who had thrown themselves off the cliffs of Suli rather than be taken by the Turks, or of my forefathers who had fought the Trojans. Whereas it was easy to want to make room in our crowded house for the heroines and heroes from Greece, it was a lot harder to live with the war experiences. They took up space, had to be fed and placated. In their presence, one was supposed to be grateful and shut up. They had names like trapped, abandoned, cheated, terrified, betrayed, and starved. And they were barely kept in check by one called saved. It's hard for me to imagine that I could articulate the word trapped as a toddler, and besides, whatever I could say at that age would have been in Greek. But I feel sure I knew what it looked like, and that it was living at our new house on Hawthorne Street. Even on moving day, as my older sisters Maria and Tina and I ran in circles from empty living room to dining room to kitchen and back to living room, they were leering from the corners. At only 2 years old, I was the slowest, and I was afraid they would reach out for me. I can't recall exactly when or how these creatures began to accrue details for me, for as in the case of my earliest memories of their presence, I don't remember being told stories about them. So for years, my father's past occupied part of my brain as barely perceptible vignettes that I would communicate now with something like the following associated word clusters. Trapped, Greece, dictator, war. Abandoned, streets. Cheated, own house. Terrified, messages, underground. Betrayed, relatives. Starved, death. Saved, return to America. By the time I could read, the war experiences began to circulate in my head as mini narratives of whose relation to each other I was fairly ignorant. I suppose I could have told you that my relatives must have left America because before they could have come back to it, but I never stopped to spell that out for myself because no one ever asked me about it. So I then go on in a very incremental way describing how these little nuggets changed and became real stories in my head, although not particularly coherent or logical stories. And just because some of you do know our family, and you'll see this if you buy the book, but that's those 4 little girls, including Georgia. She was too little to run around with us at the time. That's the house we had moved into in 1960. And my parents still live there, by the way. So I follow this development, and then I lead it into how I began to feel like I actually needed to do research to figure out what the truth was behind these memories. And that came with a certain instigation through a theoretical concept that a friend of mine actually developed. Some of you may have heard of it. The term is post-memory, and it was coined by a woman named Marianne Hirsch. And she coined that term to refer to the experience of growing up with parents whose own experiences, were so overwhelming that the children's experiences are evacuated and the parents' experiences fill that space. So that in a sense, the children's own mental life is filled with the stories of the parents, not with the children's actual experience. And when Marianne first described that concept to me, I felt not only like I immediately understood what she was talking about, but these ghosts that I described came rushing back into my being. In fact, it terrified me so much that I ran away from her and I went to my office and slammed the door shut, which was not a very mature thing to do at age 40. So I thought I knew what she was talking about. And when I set out to write this book, I challenged myself to describe what my own post-memories were, and that's what we've just heard. Okay, so I don't need to go through all the details of how I figured out to research this, but what I thought I would do is read you a section from the analysis that also quotes the story section so that you can get a feel for both. And this section, I'm particularly dealing with the topic of memory, and memory that any of us have, and I hope in the discussion we could perhaps share some memories of things where you feel you might have added things you learned later. So I'll read you a little bit about the theory, and it'll quote some parts of things my father told me. In her foundational study, Eyewitness Testimony, which first appeared in 1979 and was reissued in 1996, psychologist and adjunct professor of law Elizabeth Loftus comments that, and now I'm quoting Loftus, people's memories are fragile things. It's important to realize how easily information can be introduced into memory, to understand why this happens, and to avoid it when it's undesirable. Loftus's concern in summarizing almost a century of research on memory, including her own research on memory, is mainly directed towards clarifying the limitations of eyewitness testimony in legal proceedings. She devotes considerable attention, for instance, to the timing, manner, and content of questions that are asked of witnesses by police investigators or lawyers, and how those interactions can affect what witnesses believe they remember. Her explanations about how easily information, accurate or inaccurate, can be introduced into an individual's memory of an event personally witnessed or experienced should serve as sober warnings to any would-be memoirist or biographer, as far as I'm concerned. So here's Loftus again. In real life, as well as in experiments, people can come to believe things that never really happened, end of quote. We each probably have our favorite example, and again, I hope we'll share one, but she quotes the great psychologist Piaget, who reports that there was an attempted kidnapping of himself when he was 2 years old, the unfolding of which he says he can see completely clearly, even though he and his parents learned about a dozen years after this had supposedly occurred that the nanny had made up the attempted crime. Okay, so the crime was completely made up, but he says, I remember when the man reached into the crib and grabbed me. So my reading of Loftus reinforced a sense that reconstructing an accurate history of what had happened to my family in wartime Greece would be completely unattainable. Right? More importantly, it helped me identify some aspects of those stories that might be traceable not to duplicity or ill will or bad memory, but rather to introduced information. So now I'd like to give you an example that comes from this. At some point, my grandmother was in Greece and got the idea, I better leave now or we won't get out. And so she tried to leave an area of rural Greece that's near Delphi and get to the port of Athens in Kacandes so she could take a boat and get out of there with the kids. But this attempt failed, and at some point they returned. So this topic came up many times during the interview I had with my father, the very first one, which was in April of 2005. The first time it came up was when I was trying to figure out when and under what circumstances he had been forced to leave private school. And the second time it came up when I posed a question about what he had told me the first time. So here's now my father and me, and you can get a feel, I believe, for the sparring that was going on between the two of us. And I was particularly concerned to understand what had happened to him at the end of this school, because one of those early images I had to do with him being literally kind of pushed out the door of a school as a 10-year-old kid, and wondering how could anybody do that to a 10-year-old kid. Irene, so what do you remember about the day they actually dissolved the school? You were just kind of going along. John, the school? No. Irene, how did that happen? John, I think probably that Italy had started the war in Albania, and when my mother got notice to report to the American embassy, whatever date they invaded Greece, I don't know. Irene, October 29th, 1940? John, and then we were already on our way to Athens to leave with the last of the Americans before the German occupation. But we got as far as Theba. Thebes is a big city before Athens. Irene, yep. John, and from those planes, we watched the Germans parachute into Athens. Irene, uh-huh. You actually saw that yourself? John, oh yeah. Now, my father can't tell me a date, but he associates the message from the embassy with the date they invaded Greece. This is ambiguous since he